A black man walked into his ex-wife's wedding in nothing but a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. No jacket, no tie. His back was straight, his eyes forward. Beside him stood a white woman in a red off-shoulder gown, a diamond necklace catching every chandelier light in the room, her fingers wrapped around his arm. The ballroom went silent. The bride froze near the head table, her bouquet tilting, her lips parted. 200 guests turned their heads. No one knew who the man was. But the woman beside him, the entire city knew her name. Nathan Reed had worked as Victoria Ashford's executive secretary for 4 years. 4 years of arriving at 7:45 every morning, 15 minutes before she walked through the glass doors on the 42nd floor of Ashford Group headquarters in downtown Philadelphia. 4 years of leaving only after her black sedan disappeared from the parking garage. He prepared her coffee at exactly 8 o'clock black. No sugar. The same white ceramic mug she had used since her first day as CEO. He managed her calendar with surgical precision, screened complaints from board members, and rearranged investor calls when the tension in her jaw told him she had slept fewer than 4 hours. In 4 years, they had never shared a personal conversation that lasted longer than 30 seconds. Victoria Ashford was not cold out of cruelty. She operated on a frequency where efficiency mattered more than pleasantries, where every minute carried a dollar value she could calculate in her sleep. Nathan respected that. He had learned to read her moods through the speed of her typing, the angle at which she held her pen during conference calls, the way her shoulders shifted when a meeting was about to go badly. After 4 years, he understood her better than most people in her life, and yet she knew almost nothing about him. She did not know that he was 40 years old, that he had graduated from Temple University with a degree in business administration, or that the reason he had taken a secretarial position was because it offered the predictable hours a single father needed more than ambition. She did not know that he went home every evening to a small 2-bedroom apartment in West Philadelphia, where his daughter Lily, 8 years old, with light brown skin and her mother's dark eyes, waited at the kitchen table with her homework spread in front of her. She did not know that his ex-wife Rachel was white, that their marriage had been a source of quiet scandal in Rachel's family from the day it was announced, or that Rachel's mother had once looked at Nathan across a Christmas dinner table and said, with a smile so polite it could have been mistaken for kindness, "Rachel deserves better than this." Nathan remembered that sentence not because it was cruel, he had heard worse his entire life, but because Rachel, sitting beside him, had said nothing, not a word, not a glance. She had continued eating, as though her mother had commented on the weather. The divorce came 6 months later. Rachel cited irreconcilable differences, a polished term for the fact that she had married a black man against her family's wishes, and spent 5 years realizing that love could not insulate her from the social cost of that decision. The custody arrangement gave Nathan primary care of Lily, which surprised no one. Rachel loved their daughter, in scheduled increments, weekend visits, and holiday mornings, affection that fit neatly into a calendar. On a Tuesday afternoon, an ivory envelope arrived in Nathan's mailbox. Rachel and Brandon Hayes White, 44, owner of half the commercial real estate in Philadelphia, requested the pleasure of his presence at their wedding. The Grandview Hotel. Rachel called 2 days later, her voice pleasant and distant, explaining that Lily wanted both parents there. Nathan agreed, because he always agreed when it came to Lily. But standing in his kitchen with the invitation in his hand, he understood what this really was. Rachel did not want him there for their daughter's sake. She wanted him there as proof that she had won, that she had traded up, that the man who could not give her the life she wanted would stand in the margins and watch her get everything she dreamed of with someone else. On Thursday evening at 6:30, the Ashford Group offices were empty. The last of the junior analysts had packed up an hour earlier, and the hallways were dim and silent, lit only by the emergency strips along the baseboards and the glow of Philadelphia's skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Victoria sat alone in her corner office, reviewing quarterly earnings reports, a half-empty cup of cold coffee at her elbow, and 3 uncapped highlighters lined up beside her keyboard. Nathan knocked twice on the open door, then stepped inside without waiting for permission. It was the first time in 4 years he had done that. Victoria looked up from her laptop And the question was already forming in her eyes, the slight narrowing, the barely perceptible lift of one eyebrow, when Nathan spoke first. "I need to ask you something." His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, too stiff, too rehearsed. He had practiced this conversation 100 times during his commute, in the shower, while packing Lily's lunch, and now every version crumbled the moment the words left his mouth. Victoria set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, giving him her undivided attention for the first time that day. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 4 years of professional distance, and Nathan forced himself to keep talking before the weight of it crushed the words in his throat. He told her about the wedding, about the Grandview Hotel and its crystal chandeliers and its $200 champagne, about Brandon Hayes, the kind of man who had never once had to prove he belonged somewhere, who walked into rooms the way weather moved through open doors, naturally, inevitably, without resistance. He told her what it would mean to walk into that ballroom alone, the only black man among 200 wealthy white guests, the ex-husband, the secretary, the man who had been weighed and measured and found wanting by every metric that room would use to judge him. "Would you consider going with me? Not as anything real, just as someone standing next to me so I do not have to walk into that room alone." Victoria's expression did not change. Her face remained perfectly composed, perfectly unreadable. The seconds ticked past, each one stretching into something unbearable. "I do not do things like that." Her voice was flat, final. No explanation, no apology, just a clean statement of fact. Nathan nodded once. He had expected this answer. He had known before he walked in that she would say no. He turned to leave, his hand already reaching for the door handle, when her voice stopped him. "When is the wedding?" He looked back over his shoulder. Victoria had picked up her pen again, her gaze seemingly returned to her documents, but the pen hovered motionless above the paper, suspended in the stillness of a question she was not yet ready to answer. "Saturday, 6 o'clock, the Grandview Hotel." He hesitated. "But you said—" "I said I do not do things like that." Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a fraction of a second, something moved behind them. Not warmth, not sympathy, something sharper, something Nathan could not decode. "I did not say anything else. Good night, Nathan." It was a dismissal, clear, final. He left her office, closed the door behind him, and rode the elevator down 42 floors in a state of confusion he could not resolve. She had said no, that was certain. But she had asked when and where. Why would she need that information if she had no intention of coming? He walked to his car in the parking garage and sat behind the wheel for a long time, his forehead pressed against his knuckles. He told himself not to hope. Hope was the luxury that had nearly destroyed him during his marriage. The whispered promise that things would improve, that Rachel would eventually see how hard he was trying, that love and patience could bridge the distance the world kept placing between them. It could not. Hope was a currency Nathan could no longer afford to spend. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that felt almost mocking. Clear skies, golden light, the sort of day that belonged on postcards and wedding announcements. Nathan drove Lily to her grandmother's house that morning. He kissed her forehead and told her he would pick her up tomorrow for pancakes. He did not tell her where he was going. He did not want his daughter anywhere near what tonight might bring. She was 8 years old. She did not need to watch her father stand in a room full of people who looked at him like something to be pitied. Back at his apartment, Nathan put on his new suit. Dark gray, well-fitted, purchased 3 days ago from a department store during his lunch break. Not expensive, but respectable. The kind of suit a man wore when he wanted the world to believe he had his life together. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, adjusting the collar, straightening the lapels, examining himself from angles he did not usually bother with. The man looking back at him was presentable, clean-shaven, broad-shouldered, his shoes polished to a dull shine. He looked like someone who might belong in a room full of wealthy strangers. He knew better. He called a car service, an expense he genuinely could not afford, but he refused to pull up to his ex-wife's lavish wedding in the 12-year-old sedan, with the dented passenger door and the check engine light, that had been glowing steadily for 6 months. The Grandview Hotel was everything Rachel had always wanted, and everything Nathan had never been able to provide. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings painted with classical murals. Marble floors gleamed under soft amber lighting. Enormous arrangements of white roses and calla lilies stood at every corner like silent judges, their fragrance thick and faintly suffocating. Nathan walked into the lobby and felt the weight of eyes settle on him immediately. He was one of perhaps 3 black faces in a crowd of over 200. A young woman at the check-in table handed him his seating card with a smile that held a fraction of a second too long, the kind of performative warmth that people offered when they were trying very hard not to look surprised. Table 14, near the back of the ballroom. Behind a marble pillar that blocked most of the view of the main stage, the ceremony began at 6 o'clock sharp. A harpist played something classical and expensive as the wedding party processed down an aisle lined with white rose petals and flickering candles in crystal votives. Rachel walked last, escorted by her father, a retired investment banker whose expression carried the specific satisfaction of seeing a mistake finally corrected. Her gown probably cost more than Nathan earned in a year ivory silk and hand-stitched lace that caught the chandelier light like something from a magazine. Brandon waited at the altar, tall, tanned, confident, his posture radiating the quiet certainty of a man who had never questioned whether he belonged. Nathan watched them exchange vows through hidden speakers, and something settled in his chest, like a stone dropped in still water. Not jealousy. Recognition. He had stood where Brandon was standing once. He had believed with everything he had that love was enough to build a life on. He had been wrong. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. The guests erupted in applause, and somewhere a woman sobbed with a theatrical emotion that weddings seemed to require. Nathan clapped along with everyone else, his palms meeting softly, mechanically, the sound swallowed by the noise around him. When the newlyweds kissed, the ballroom filled with camera flashes, and Nathan sat perfectly still, his water glass untouched, his expression arranged into something he hoped looked like polite indifference. The reception began with a 12-piece band replacing the harpist, and waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvre that Nathan could not identify. He stayed at table 14, alone, eating nothing, trying to become invisible. Rachel found him 45 minutes into the reception, near the dessert table where elaborate pastries were arranged, like architecture. She had switched to lower heels, and 2 bridesmaids flanked her like bodyguards, their faces arranged in expressions of careful neutrality. She approached with the kind of gracious smile that never quite reached her eyes, the same smile she had used when introducing Nathan to her colleagues during their marriage, warm on the surface, apologetic underneath. "Nathan, you came." Her voice was pleasant, calibrated for the audience she knew was watching. "I was not sure you would." "You invited me," Nathan said simply. Rachel looked him over from head to toe, her gaze traveling slowly, appraisingly, the way someone might examine a piece of furniture they had once owned and then donated. "I just assumed you would bring someone, a girlfriend maybe." She paused, letting the silence do its work. "Or are you still on your own?" Another pause, longer this time, waited with the kind of sympathy that was designed to wound rather than comfort. "Some people just are not built to find someone else, Nathan, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. Really." Before he could respond, Brandon appeared at Rachel's side, sliding an arm around her waist with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. His handshake, when he offered it, was firm to the point of hostility, the kind of grip that turned a greeting into a statement. "The ex-husband," Brandon said, grinning broadly. "Rachel has told me all about you. Thanks for coming, man. I know this cannot be easy." He glanced around the ballroom with proprietary satisfaction, taking in the chandeliers and the ice sculptures and the band and all the other evidence of a life Nathan had never been able to afford. "Rachel deserves all of this, you know. She spent too many years settling for less. I am just glad I could finally give her the life she always deserved." Each sentence landed like a precise blow, unhurried, devastating. Nathan heard what was really being said beneath the polished surface. You were not enough. You were never enough. She upgraded, and now everyone in this room can see exactly how far she has risen, and exactly where you remain. Nathan kept his face carefully blank. I hope you are both very happy, he said, and the words turned to ash in his mouth. They drifted away, swallowed by their crowd of admirers, and Nathan stood alone beside the dessert table, with the wreckage of his dignity at his feet. The whispers started after that, quiet at first, then gathering momentum like a current. A woman in pearls leaned toward her companion. That is the ex? Poor thing. A man in pinstripes asked what Nathan did for a living, and when he answered executive secretary, the man's expression performed a small involuntary contortion. Surprise, recalibration, dismissal, all in the space of a single heartbeat. A secretary. Well, that is certainly a stable profession. His eyes traveled briefly to Nathan's skin, then snapped away, as though he had caught himself looking at something he was not supposed to notice. Then came the moment that broke him. A friend of Brandon's, loud and flushed with champagne, cornered Nathan near the bar and leaned in close enough for Nathan to smell the alcohol on his breath. So you are the guy who could not keep Rachel happy. The man laughed and clapped Nathan on the shoulder, with the familiarity of someone who believed wealth entitled him to anyone's personal space. Do not take it hard, buddy. Some things are just out of reach, you know? Some circles are not really built for everyone. His gaze moved slowly over Nathan's face and hands, lingering in a way that made the subtext impossible to miss. This was not about money or profession. This was about something older and uglier. Something embedded so deeply in the room that most people in it would never acknowledge it existed. Nathan said nothing. His throat had closed and his hands trembled at his sides. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to be anywhere but here, surrounded by people who had already decided what he was worth, based on the color of his skin and the size of his paycheck. He turned away from the bar without a word and pushed through the French doors that led to the hotel's garden, and the night air hit him like cold water, clean, sharp, carrying the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass. The garden was beautiful. Manicured hedges lined stone pathways that wound through clusters of ornamental trees, draped with tiny white lights. A fountain murmured somewhere in the darkness, and the air smelled of damp earth and the faint sweetness of roses that had been planted specifically for events like this, for people like the ones inside that ballroom. But Nathan saw none of it. He walked until he found a bench hidden behind a wall of flowering bushes, tucked away from the pathways and the windows, and anyone who might come looking for a quiet place to take a phone call. He sat down heavily, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed, his breath coming in slow, deliberate pulls that he counted the way. He counted everything quietly, methodically, as though precision could hold the rest of him together. He was not angry at Rachel. She had made her choice 3 years ago, and he had accepted it the way he accepted everything, without raising his voice during the divorce proceedings, without speaking badly about her in front of Lily, without the dramatic confrontations that other men might have staged. He had simply signed the papers in a lawyer's office while Rachel talked about fresh starts and finding herself, then packed his clothes into 3 cardboard boxes and moved into an apartment where the hot water ran out after 12 minutes and the radiator clanked through the night like a broken clock. He was not angry at Brandon, whose smugness was simply the predictable behavior of a man who had never been tested, never been made to earn his place, never walked into a room wondering whether the people inside saw him as a person or a category. He was angry at himself for hoping, for trying, for driving across the city in a rented car and putting on a suit he could not afford, and walking into that ballroom believing that any of it, the pressed lapels, the polished shoes, the straight back, could change the way the world saw a man who looked like him. It could not. It never would. He was Nathan Reed's secretary, ex-husband, single black father who could not give his wife the life she wanted. That was his story, and no suit would rewrite it. Nathan stood slowly, brushed off his jacket, and made a decision. He would go back inside, retrieve his coat from the check, and leave quietly, the way he had always done everything, without making a scene, without demanding attention, without expecting anyone to notice or care. There was no dignity left to salvage, no reason to stay. Tomorrow he would pick up Lily, make her pancakes, and return to the life he had built. Small, quiet, invisible. He began walking toward the French doors, preparing himself to re-enter that ballroom one last time as the man everyone expected him to be. And then he heard the sound of tires on gravel. A car pulling up to the hotel entrance. A black sedan rolled to a stop beneath the entrance awning. Sleek and understated. The kind of vehicle that whispered wealth rather than announcing it. The driver stepped out, circled the car with practiced efficiency, and opened the rear passenger door. A woman emerged into the golden glow of the entrance lights. She was wearing a red off-shoulder evening gown, simple in its cut, but unmistakably expensive. The kind of dress that needed no label because the fabric spoke for itself. A diamond necklace rested against her collarbone, catching the light with each step she took. Her hair was swept back in a low chignon, not a strand out of place. And she moved with the quiet, lethal confidence of someone who had walked into boardrooms full of hostile executives and emerged with everything she wanted. Victoria Ashford stood at the entrance of the Grand View Hotel, her eyes scanning the grounds with the precision of a woman who was looking for exactly one thing. Nathan froze in the garden path, his heart slamming against his ribs, so hard he could feel it in his throat. She had said no. She had been silent for 2 full days, no text, no email, no mention of his request during their normal Friday interactions at the office. Not even the faintest reference disguised as small talk. He had told himself, ordered himself not to hope. He had buried the possibility so completely that finding it now felt like unearthing something he had already grieved for and given up. And yet here she stood, under the entrance lights, in a dress the color of something that burned. Her gaze found him across the distance, cutting through the garden shadows like a searchlight, and she began walking in his direction. Her heels clicked softly against the stone pathway, each step deliberate, unhurried, filled with a kind of purpose that did not require explanation. She stopped a few feet from him. The sounds of the reception floated through the night air. Laughter, music, the distant clink of crystal, but here in the garden, surrounded by jasmine and the hum of insects, there was only silence. You came. Nathan's voice was rough, unfamiliar to his own ears. Victoria tilted her head and regarded him with those cool, assessing eyes. I said no to pretending to be your girlfriend, she said evenly. I never said no to showing up. Nathan shook his head slowly. Why? Because in 4 years, you have never asked me for a single thing. Her voice dropped in register, becoming something quieter and more precise. Not a raise, not a day off, not even a longer lunch break. And then you walked into my office and asked me something that clearly cost you everything you had just to say out loud. She took 1 step closer, and Nathan saw something in her expression that he had never once witnessed in 4 years of studying her face. Not warmth, not quite, but something adjacent to it, something that looked like recognition, like one solitary person seeing another across a distance that neither of them had chosen. I do not do things like this, but I also do not ignore someone who deserves to have a person standing beside him. She extended her hand toward him, palm up, steady as a level. Let us go inside. Nathan looked at her hand, then at her face, then at her hand again. Part of him wanted to refuse, to say he did not need rescuing, that he had already made peace with being exactly what everyone expected. But that part was small and exhausted and losing badly to the rest of him, the part that had been humiliated and dismissed and reduced to a footnote all evening, the part that wanted just once to walk into a room without apology. He took her hand. They walked through the garden together, past the flowering hedges and the twinkling lights, toward the French doors that led back into the reception. Neither of them spoke. Victoria's hand rested lightly on Nathan's arm, her grip steady and unhurried, as though they had done this 1,000 times before. Somewhere between the bench and the entrance, Nathan realized he had left his jacket draped over the garden bench. By the time he noticed, they were already at the doors, and it no longer mattered. He was going back and wearing a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and the woman beside him was wearing a necklace worth more than his apartment building. The moment they stepped through the doors, The ballroom shifted. It did not happen all at once. A few heads near the entrance turned first, a woman pausing mid-laugh, a man lowering his champagne flute, a waiter freezing with a tray balanced on his palm. Then the shift spread outward in concentric waves, table by table, conversation by conversation, until the entire room had reoriented itself toward the entrance like iron filings drawn to a magnet. 200 pairs of eyes settled on Nathan Reed. He had walked into this ballroom 90 minutes ago, and no one had noticed. Now every person in the room was looking at him. And for the first time that evening, those eyes were not filled with pity or condescension, or the particular discomfort that white people performed when they encountered a black man in a space they considered theirs. They were filled with shock, with curiosity, and with something that looked, unmistakably, like respect. The whispers ignited immediately, but they carried a different charge now. "Who is she?" A woman near the bar murmured to her husband. "She looks familiar." A man in a charcoal suit squinted across the room, and then his eyes went wide. "That is Victoria Ashford, CEO of Ashford Group." The name traveled through the crowd like voltage through a wire, carrying with it the accumulated weight of a billion-dollar portfolio, a reputation for ruthlessness that bordered on legend, and the kind of influence that made men like Brandon Hayes look like small-town landlords playing at significance. The same guests who had dismissed Nathan minutes earlier were suddenly adjusting their ties, straightening their postures, rearranging their faces into expressions of interest and deference, where contempt had been just moments before. Rachel noticed first. She had been accepting congratulations near the head table, her wedding smile locked firmly in place, when her gaze drifted toward the ballroom entrance and froze. The smile collapsed. The color left her face in a single visible wave, starting at her cheeks and draining downward until she looked almost ill. And when she recognized the woman standing beside her ex-husband, truly recognized her, understood not just who she was, but what her presence in this room signified, something moved across Rachel's expression that Nathan had never seen in all the years he had known her. Uncertainty, and behind it, unmistakably, fear. Brandon materialized at Rachel's side, following her gaze. The easy, proprietary confidence that had carried him through the entire evening faltered visibly, replaced by something more cautious, more calculating. He approached Nathan and Victoria, with his hand extended, but the aggression was gone. His grip was measured. His smile was careful. "I do not believe we have met," Brandon said, his voice pitched lower than before. Brandon Hayes. Victoria accepted the handshake with a brief, polite smile that stopped well short of her eyes. "Victoria Ashford. I am here with Nathan." She said it without emphasis, without performance, as though the statement required no elaboration. But the 5 words landed in the silence of that ballroom like stones dropped from a great height. She released Brandon's hand and turned to Rachel, who stood nearby clutching her bouquet against her hip like a shield. "Congratulations on your wedding. I hope you will both be very happy." The words were courteous, but Victoria's tone stripped them of sentiment entirely, turning a well-wish into something closer to a formality. The polite equivalent of a CEO, acknowledging an intern's presentation before returning to the agenda that actually mattered. Rachel forced her smile back into place, though it was brittle now, a porcelain mask with hairline fractures running through it. "I did not realize Nathan knew people in your position." The hesitation before position was slight, almost imperceptible, but Nathan heard it clearly, and he knew Victoria heard it too. It was the same pause Rachel's mother had used at that Christmas dinner years ago, the same microsecond delay that polite society inserted before words, designed to remind everyone of the distances they were supposed to maintain. It carried an entire architecture of assumption that a black man who worked as a secretary had no business standing beside a woman of Victoria's stature, that the gap between them was not merely professional but categorical, that some boundaries existed for reasons too obvious to state aloud. Victoria's reply came without inflection, without heat, without anything that could be interpreted as defensiveness or justification. "Nathan has worked with me for 4 years. He is the most competent professional I have ever had the privilege of relying on." She did not elaborate. She did not list his qualifications, or explain their relationship, or offer any context that might soften the statement. It was a single sentence, delivered the way she might announce a quarterly earnings figure as settled fact, beyond argument. But it repositioned Nathan entirely in the social geometry of the room. He was no longer the abandoned ex-husband, the man who could not keep Rachel happy, the secretary who had wandered into a world above his station. He was someone chosen, someone valued, someone who had earned his place beside a woman whose name alone could rearrange the power dynamics of any room she entered. Brandon attempted to reclaim the conversation, his tone still cordial but stripped bare of its earlier arrogance. "Ashford Group. We actually submitted a proposal for the East Side Commercial Development Project last year. We were hoping to establish a partnership." He said it the way a man might mention a mutual acquaintance, trying to locate himself on a map that had suddenly been redrawn with his territory much smaller than he had imagined. Victoria looked at him for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds of silence that stretched like a wire pulled taut, long enough for Brandon to feel the true distance between his world and hers, long enough for him to understand that she knew precisely where his company sat in the hierarchy of things that mattered. "I remember the proposal," she said quietly. "It did not make it past the preliminary round." The words landed softly, almost gently, like snow settling on a frozen lake. But Brandon's face drained of color. Rachel stood beside him, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound, and for the first time all evening, she had nothing to say. No barbs, no pitying observations about Nathan's loneliness, no condescending commentary about people who were not built to find someone. She simply stood there, looking at the woman beside her ex-husband, recalculating and rewriting everything she had believed about the man she had left behind. Nathan and Victoria did not stay long after that. There was no need. The point had been made, not through argument or confrontation, or any of the dramatic gestures that Nathan had imagined during his sleepless nights, but through the simple, undeniable fact of Victoria's presence. Nathan offered polite goodbyes to the few guests who suddenly found reasons to speak with him, their voices warmer now, their handshakes firmer, their eyes registering something they had refused to see 10 minutes earlier. The man in pinstripes who had called secretarial work stable now asked for Nathan's business card. The woman in pearls who had murmured "poor thing" was smiling at him with the particular brightness of someone hoping to be remembered favorably. Nathan accepted their sudden warmth, without bitterness, and without the satisfaction he might have expected to feel. He collected his coat from the check and walked out of the Grandview Hotel with Victoria beside him, the night air cool against his face, the sounds of the reception fading behind them, like music from a room he had already left. The black sedan waited at the curb, its engine idling softly in the darkness. The driver held the door open without expression, and they slid inside. The car pulled away from the hotel, and Nathan watched the Grandview's illuminated facade shrink in the rear window, the chandeliers visible through the tall windows, the valets standing beneath the awning, the last traces of a world he had never belonged to, and no longer needed to all of it, diminishing into a point of light, before disappearing entirely as the sedan turned onto Broad Street. Inside the car, silence. Not uncomfortable, not expectant. Just the natural quiet of 2 people who had spent 4 years occupying adjacent spaces without needing to fill every moment with words. Nathan watched the city lights slide past the window, the familiar blocks of Center City giving way to the narrower streets and brick row houses of West Philadelphia, the world shrinking back to its normal proportions. With every block they traveled, he tried to find language for what he was feeling, and could not. There were no words precise enough for the particular sensation of having your dignity returned to you by someone who owed you nothing. "Thank you," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know how to." "You do not need to thank me." Victoria was looking out her own window, her profile sharp and still against the passing lights. "You deserve to have someone there. That is all." He waited for her to say more, about what this evening meant, about whether things between them would be different now, whether the boundary they had maintained for 4 years had shifted permanently, or merely bent for one night, before snapping back into place, about any of the questions circling in his mind like moths around a lamp. But she offered nothing more. She sat in comfortable silence, asking nothing, expecting nothing, giving nothing except the fact of her presence beside him in the dark interior of a car, moving through the Philadelphia night. And somehow, in a way Nathan could not have predicted or explained, that was exactly what he needed. Not a grand gesture, not a declaration, just someone who had seen him at his lowest and chosen to stand beside him without asking for anything in return. The car stopped in front of Nathan's apartment building, a 3-story brick walk-up that looked almost apologetic next to the grandeur they had just left behind. Nathan stepped onto the sidewalk and turned back to the open door. Victoria remained in the car, watching him from the leather interior with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, but something in between. Acknowledgement without promise. Recognition without definition. "Good night, Nathan." "Good night, Victoria." He climbed 3 flights of stairs in the dark, each step creaking under his weight, in the familiar rhythm he had memorized over 3 years of living in this building. He unlocked his door and stood in the silence of his empty apartment for a long time without moving. Lily was at her grandmother's house, probably asleep by now, curled up in the guest bed with her stuffed elephant tucked under her chin. The rooms held only the hum of the refrigerator, and the faint murmur of traffic from the street below, and the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock that Lily had picked out at a yard sale because it had a picture of a cat on it. He did not turn on the lights. He walked to the living room window and looked out at the city below, the street lamps casting long amber shadows on the cracked sidewalk, the ordinary world stretching in every direction. A world that had nothing to do with crystal chandeliers or diamond necklaces or the judgment of strangers who would forget his name by morning. For the first time in years, Nathan did not feel like a failure. He did not feel like a footnote in someone else's story, or a cautionary tale that guests would whisper about at brunch the next morning. He felt like exactly what he was: a good father, a decent man, someone who had been weighed and tested and humiliated, and had come through all of it with his dignity unbroken. Victoria had not promised him anything. She had not offered love or a future or any of the things people usually expected from moments like the one they had shared. She had simply shown up. She had taken his hand and walked into a room beside him, and in doing so, she had reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten, that his worth was not determined by the people who looked down on him, not by the color of his skin, or the balance in his bank account, or the verdict of a room full of strangers who measured human value in square footage and stock portfolios. His worth was determined by the man he chose to be when no one was watching. Tomorrow, life would continue. He would wake early, drive to the suburbs, and bring Lily home. He would make the chocolate chip pancakes she always requested on Sunday mornings, and listen to her talk about school and swimming lessons and whatever new song she had learned during the week. On Monday, he would return to the office, and Victoria would greet him with the same cool, efficient nod she always had. She would accept the coffee without comment. She would hand him documents without looking up, and he would sit outside her door and resume the quiet, competent work that had defined their 4 years together. Nothing would change, and everything would be different.